Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of our wrestling. I'm your host, JP John Poz. With me today, very special returning guest, a journalist, a wrestling historian, of course, the author of the WCW Nitro book, the book Grateful about Eric Bischoff, and of course, David Penzer's Sitting Ringside, Volume 1. He is Mr. Guy Evans. Guy, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing great, John. So great to speak with you again. I appreciate the invite.
What is going on in your world? You seem like you're very, very busy.
Yes, indeed. There's quite a lot going on, and I think it's safe to say as the weeks go by here this summer, there'll be even more going on. So if people have seen some of the recent news as it relates to some programming that's going to be airing next month, that'll be very interesting, I think, for people who listen to your show. And of course, as you mentioned, had the book Grateful with Eric Bischoff that came out about 18 months ago, and recently put out a new book with David Penzer, which I know that we'll talk about today, and very pleased with the reaction that that's getting so far. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's amazing when you look at the history of WCW, and there's a lot of stuff coming out. Like you said, the Bischoff book, obviously you authored, you're a big part of this Panzer book, which looks great, and then that Vice series, the Death of WCW, somewhat revisited by The Rock.
Mm.
So very WCW centric going on right now.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I remember about 10 years ago, somewhere around the time of that Monday Night Wars series and the launch of the network. And then, of course, you had the Triple H Sting match at WrestleMania, which was kind of the, uh, you know, I think some people interpreted that as the time at the time as, um, a signal that we were finally moving on past this era, and there's nothing else that could possibly be said about it, and it's time to put the Monday Night Wars to bed. It's funny to think about that time now and consider where we are in 2024, where the interest in that time period just seems to persist and sustain itself. And I think just when you think there's nothing else that could be covered or could be said, something will come out that surprises you. So I think that's very much going to be the case with the show that's going to air on Vice next month, and also with respect to the book that David Penzer and I just put out, Sitting Ringside, because not only are we telling David's story, of course he had the best seat in the house, if you like, literally being ringside for all of these historic happenings on the WCW side during the Monday Night Wars, and we're telling that story from his vantage point. But also we have, I think, about 220 pages of bonus materials in the book. So if you ever wanted to see the format from the last ever episode of Nitro, or you wanted to see what was written down originally the night that David Arquette won the belt, or the Nitro format when Vince Russo became champion, all of that is in the book as well. So I think people have equally enjoyed going through his story as well as flipping through some of those formats and documents at the back of the book as well.
See, that's what's so cool about that book and him being there and him preserving all that history, him saving those formats, is because people have never seen them before, and it's just amazing
Mhm.
to see, like, wow, what you guys kind of unearthed right there.
Yeah, and we sort of found ourselves in a similar position because I find myself with a lot of stuff that simply due to time and space constraints I couldn't fit into the Nitro book, even though we ended up putting out an expanded hardcover edition of the book. You can't put something out that's 1,500 pages, right? So at some point you have to make a decision of what goes in there and what doesn't. And so I was in a spot where I was holding on to a lot of stuff that I had uncovered and found in my research, and obviously he had done the same through firsthand experience of actually working there. And so I think that's what both gave us the idea originally to do something with these printed materials. And originally we were thinking perhaps a scrapbook, something like that, and maybe some recollections mixed in. We're thinking maybe we'll pick out some names from these formats and documents and memos that each of us has, and kind of expound on that in certain areas. But the more that I ended up interviewing Dave and really getting to know him and his story, it became obvious to me that we needed to tell that story. And I think people will really be surprised about the circumstances which preceded him getting involved in wrestling, and how he really had to fight and scratch and claw for his position, and how hard he worked and how dedicated he was to maintain that position. Of course, he was the only person, to our knowledge, that actually attended every episode of Nitro and Thunder and Saturday Night and the pay-per-views during the Nitro run. That we know of, and so I think that really speaks to just how committed he was to the company, and how resolute he was to maintain and hold on to that opportunity. And so all of that comes out in the book as well. And Dave really has a unique take on things, and it's not just a blow by blow recollection of here's what happened week to week on all of the shows, the same sort of stories and perspectives that you've heard a million times. I think if you check out the book Sitting Ringside, you'll take away a lot of new information from this as well. So we're both very pleased with the book, and very happy to see the feedback that we've got so far.
And he brought up something to me. I was his first ever interview. He said, "So this is all my fault, technically, because I got the juices flowing. I got his creativity going, thinking, hey, I could do a podcast. Hey, I'm going to write this book." So he gave me some credit. So I'll take that. Thank you, Dave.
There you go. So the genesis of the whole thing is down to you, John. So when we come out with an expanded version of this book, I'll be sure to credit you for that.
Yes, yes. I wouldn't have said it, but he gave me the credit. So I said, "Wow, really? All right, Dave. I'll
So
take that."
it's on the record now.
Yes. Greatest thing though, the fact that WCW, obviously, we know 83 weeks of dominance, really more than that. It's really 2 years of dominance, but
Mhm.
he's there for all that. I mean, that's so cool, and you don't get to see, like, you can get guys that were here for bits and pieces, and I was at this show, and I was here for that, but to be there for everyone, that is truly remarkable.
Yeah, and I think it's really the ultimate fly on the wall account, and that's really Dave's primary strength. I think that he brings to a book like this is the fact that he admits he was a huge fan growing up, and always had a dream of working in the business, and was able to make that happen, and found himself being in rooms and situations where now he's working alongside a lot of his childhood idols, whether they be a Mean Gene Okerlund or Bobby the Brain Heenan or Roddy Piper. The list is endless, really. And he was able to sit back and really take all of this in. And I found him to be a very perceptive person in terms of the way he was able to recall some of his interactions with these people, and really explain to you what their personality was really like behind the curtain. Because a lot of people, and a lot of this I think is natural with the passage of time. When you ask them about their experience working with a certain talent or a certain character or backstage official, they'll give you some sort of platitudes and maybe a generic comment here or there, but it can be hard to remember after so many years specifics and details and stories. And David is really good at that, and he's really good at giving you a nuanced view of a person. I can think of a couple of passages in the book where he talks about Roddy Piper, Kevin Sullivan, Mean Gene, as I mentioned, Eric, all of these different people that he had that fly on the wall perspective of. And he's able to really give you a level of insight that most people couldn't. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I thought that early on in the process we needed to turn this into more of a traditional autobiography. But actually what ended up happening is we're kind of giving you two books in one, really, because I think those formats and documents and everything that we mentioned alone would be enough to fill a book, and would give people a lot of interest and enjoyment. But when you pair that with the full length story, we cover his whole journey all the way from birth essentially to the end of WCW, and we'll be picking that up in volume 2, because we'll be releasing a follow-up book as well. I think it's like I say, it's kind of like two books in one. So if you enjoyed the Nitro book, and if you just have any sort of interest in that time period in wrestling, this is definitely a worthy addition, I think, to your bookshelf. This new book with Dave Penzer.
Very, very cool stuff. I'm just a huge WCW fan, so the WCW centric stuff is great. But I mean, The roster there was unbelievable. Just everything that he could possibly have, like knowledge-wise, is
Yeah.
just amazing because of the stories you could have from being a fly on the wall in the biggest company in wrestling at that point, and you're at Nitro, you're at Thunder, you're at Saturday Night.
Mm.
Just it is crazy to think like, man, David Penzer was there for everything.
That's right, and I think, as he talked about with you actually recently, I think as time has gone on and with him having the experience of doing this book and being interviewed, for it and reflecting on all of these times, I think it's really started to dawn on him how lucky he was to have some of these experiences. Particularly when he talks about things like being in the announce team trailer before every episode of Nitro and Thunder. So having 2 or 3 hours to sit back and listen to, the Heenans and the Okerlunds and Tony Schiavone's and Zabisco's, Mike Tenay's trade stories with each other and make each other laugh and talk about what's going on in the company, and to be able to see that on a consistent basis for 2 or 3 hours at a time. In talking to him, I think it really started to dawn on him like, wow, I was the ultimate fan who ended up having this experience. And the more we talked about it, the more certain things came back to him, and he was able to recall some of those specific details. So I think there are other books that do a great job of going through, on this date, this happened on an episode of Nitro, and taking you through the in-ring action. And we do cover, the necessary elements of that. It's not to say that we put that to the side, but this is really a book where you're going to get more of an appreciation for the people and who they were when the cameras weren't on. And he's very, very honest when it comes to that. And that's something that I appreciated as well. So that also helps make it, I think, a really unique story. And that's a testament to David, I think.
And as far as you are concerned, I mean, covering this and David and that his time in WCW, Eric Bischoff and his time in WCW, you're becoming the WCW master. I mean, you're the go-to WCW historian.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but it's just something that's organically evolved, I think. Bizarrely enough, I mean, when I wrote the Nitro book, that was really intended to be my one contribution, I suppose, to wrestling literature, if you like. I wanted to come out with the book, and I figured that it would have some kind of audience and it would be received positively by a certain segment of people. Never could have I have imagined how many people it was going to reach and what kind of impact it was going to have. And that just kind of naturally led to Eric and I developing a relationship, I suppose, and communicating, and eventually coming up with the idea to collaborate on his second book. And same sort of thing with David. I connected with him in doing the Nitro book originally, and interviewed him way back in probably 2014 or 15 for that book, and sort of reconnected when this idea came about. So as I'm sure you've seen probably in your own work, and how long you've been doing this, and some of the opportunities that's led to for you, it's an old cliche, but sometimes one thing just kind of leads to another. So I didn't necessarily sit back years ago and say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come out with this first book, and that's going to lead to this, and that's going to lead to that. And similarly, I have no idea sort of where things are going to go from here. But it's been a very rewarding and very gratifying thing to see what's come out of the passion project, which was the Nitro book originally, and everything that came thereafter. So I'm if you'll excuse the pun, I'm very grateful for all of that.
Of course, and the book Grateful with Eric. And I remember I interviewed Bischoff a few times, but I remember one time more recently, I was asking him about Grateful, and he was saying you
Mm.
did such a good job with the Nitro book, and he really appreciated that. But it wasn't like kissing his ass. You were like very honest. There was some negative stuff about him too, but he really appreciated like the honest coverage of it, unlike maybe some other things that he's read that where he's like, oh, this is bullshit. That person didn't know, and blah blah. He actually said he really appreciated just how flat out honest you were, whether it was complimenting him or not.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, and it's interesting, isn't it? As time goes on, sometimes certain things get lost in the shuffle, and I suppose it would be tempting to look at the fact that the Nitro book was written, and then of course Grateful came out and sort of developed some assumptions based on that. But as you correctly pointed out there, if you go back and look at the Nitro book, there's a lot of content which I think Eric has said on many occasions was difficult for him to read about himself, and he's told me personally that that there was some stuff in there that was very difficult to read and was it didn't paint me in the most positive light and was really tough for me to get through at times. But he's essentially said, in many different ways and in many different forums, which is, I'm so grateful for. He said it's what happened. It's the truth. It's this is the story, and this is what you need to read. And I think that was really the impetus for me, ultimately working with Eric, was the fact that I just find that to be so commendable. The fact that he was able to look at the book in its entirety and say, yeah, I didn't like a lot of this stuff, but people need to go out their way to read this thing, and I'm going to recommend that everyone do that if you really want to understand what happened with WCW. I've said this before, and I apologize if I'm being a broken record, because I'm sure I've said this with you as well, John. But if we were to put any of ourselves in that position, would we really have the ability to separate our personal feelings from our wider analysis of a book like that? I'm not so sure that we would. If someone wrote a book about a company that we were integrally involved in, and pointed out a lot of the errors that were made and a lot of the things that could have been done better, and quoted as many people as the book does who were reflecting sometimes in not the most positive ways about us, would we still be able to say, yeah, it's kind of a tough read at times, but you know what, you need to go out and get this book? I think it's human nature in that situation to dismiss a project like that completely out of hand, which he could very well have done. He could have gone on 83 weeks and just said, this is just another in a long line of BS about WCW and about me, and it's not even worth your time. And of course, I had no idea what he was going to say. I figured that they were going to address it at some point. But I just find that, so rare and so commendable, as I said, and that really planted the seeds for us to work together. And I've got to say, for Conrad and Eric, I'm very thankful that they have referenced the book as many times as they have and have talked about it as many times as they have. Even to this day, people will still send me emails. In fact, a couple of hours ago, I got one from someone before we got on here where he had just finished the book and said, I first heard about it through a recent podcast with Eric and Conrad. So, what can I say about that other than being just very thankful for how they and yourself and so many other people have spread the word about the book.
It's an amazing book, of course. Nitro, The Incredible Rise and an Inevitable Collapse of Ted Turner's WCW. Awesome book. If anybody hasn't read it, definitely go out there and do it. Now, what are you doing now for Conrad? Because it seems like I see you popping up on ad-free shows.
Yeah, that's right. So we started a new series at the beginning of the year, which we're calling Beyond Nitro. It's a monthly series exclusive to adfreeshows.com members. And essentially what we're doing is taking an aspect of the Nitro book and kind of blowing it up, if you like, putting a magnifying glass on it and exploring it within the confines of a monthly podcast. And I also accompany the release of the podcast with an article for people to read as well. So I'll write an article on a particular subject, sort of derived from the book, and then discuss it in a podcast form. So they're kind of getting a bit of a 2-for-1. And again, we've had a really great reaction to that series. I just finished recording an episode with Neil Pruitt, who was, of course, famously the voice of the NWO, so to speak, and feature producer with WCW. And we were talking about some of the aspects and elements of the production process that people may or may not be aware of, sort of things like the importance of audio and how that was achieved in a live environment, and what it was like to work with the likes of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage and Piper and so on and so forth, and how someone like Neil related to them from his position. Some of the challenges that came with pulling off some of the things that WCW wanted the production team to do back in the day. Did a great interview with Neil, and that's sort of the basis for this month's episode. And my philosophy with it really is to try to do something different every single month. I'm sort of a big fan of variety and keeping things fresh for people. So, we're sort of uncovering a lot of new details in that series as well, and also reinforcing some of the things that people really liked about the Nitro book. So, definitely encourage people to go to adfreeshows.com. I think they're making it available for people at the $29 level and above, if I'm not mistaken. And the name of the show, once again, is Beyond Nitro. So if you've enjoyed some of the things we've been talking about so far, definitely check that out.
And I love you mentioned Neil Pruitt, your old buddy from the Secrets of Nitro podcast back in the day, if you will.
That's right. As you pointed out there, Neil and I had a podcast, Secrets of Nitro. It's actually kind of interesting to reflect on how that came about. Neil was someone that I interviewed for the book initially, and for some reason we just hit it off, almost immediately, and started talking very frequently after that initial interview. And the more that I spoke to Neil, the more that I realized he not only was more of an integral part of some of the more famous segments and aspects of the shows when WCW was really on fire than I probably first realized. Not only did I get an appreciation for that, but I also learned that he recalled just a tremendous amount of detail as it relates to some of those segments. So, even things that were kind of just completely off the wall and zany, like people might remember the time when Roddy Piper was quote unquote at Alcatraz, right? And he's ranting about Hogan, and it was the whole build up to the Super Brawl pay-per-view. Well, you don't always think about who was on the other side of the camera, or who was directing or assisting the talent for something like that. And Neil was that guy. He was, more often than not, the person out there in the field making a lot of these segments come to life. And he just remembers, so much about that. He can tell you down to the exact type of equipment that was used and some of the challenges that came about. And here's where we had to adapt on the fly and all of those kind of things. So, people can go back and listen to Secrets of Nitro. I think we did about 45 episodes where he'll tell you about a memorable shoot or a memorable promo that he was involved in producing. And again, similar to Dave Penzer, actually, if we can draw that connection, Neil is really good at not just giving a generic, vague answer to something. He's exceptionally good at giving, really, I would say, an unprecedented amount of detail about some of these really memorable moments that we all remember so fondly. So that's probably one of the nicest things that's come out of doing the book, is just developing a great friendship with Neil. And who knows, he may be popping up on the screen shortly in the month of June. You never know, so stay tuned for that.
I was hoping so. I was definitely hoping so. Speaking of popping up on the screen, and it's funny, I wrote myself a note a while ago, and then I kind of made sure I remembered that I wrote myself a note. It's one of those things you got to remember you actually wrote it to begin with. But Brad Siegel recently did an interview with, I think it's pretty recent because it looked like it was, with Turner Classic Movies. And I
Mm.
wrote myself a note. You have to ask Guy about it. Did you see this? Was this recent? And did you check it out with Brad Siegel?
This is with Turner Classic Movies, you said?
Yes, yes, they're interviewing him, I guess, all about like that channel and that station
Mm.
and kind of what his role was with Turner.
No, I can't say that I've seen him. No.
Oh, I knew you would kind of be interested. I'll see if I could find it again.
Mm.
Um, because I was just like kind of like, wow, like he's doing interviews now. I guess if it isn't to do with wrestling, he'll do it. You know what I mean? He doesn't like wrestling.
Well, maybe if we come back on here in a month, I can have more to say about that.
Yes. Oh, nice. Okay, good, good. Because I kind of think that he should be out there more, just talking about wrestling because I think so many people are interested in what he has to say.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of those kind of people, I suppose, whether they be a Brad Siegel or a Harvey Schiller, Jamie Kellner. As I think we've talked about before, there's these kind of shadowy figures that we've heard about over the years that, had in some cases a large amount of influence over what ultimately happened with WCW, that obviously are not going to be doing podcasts or are going to be out there regularly discussing it. But I think that was one of the things the Nitro book was able to do quite nicely, is incorporate some of those perspectives and give you more of a well-rounded, holistic view of exactly what happened, to complement, the important contributions of those people on the wrestling side also. But logically, you can kind of see why certain people wouldn't necessarily remember that time as the most fondest in their careers, and don't typically want to revisit it. But yeah, I think maybe next time we connect, we'll have more to say about that.
Nice, I like that. Now, it's funny, like when you look at some of the stuff that's coming out there, right? Like this Death of WCW thing on Vice, people are saying, "Oh, what else can there be covered? It's covered to death. The Rock is going to rip apart WCW. They're going to blame Russo." I mean, is this the stuff you're hearing too? Just before, just from like the internet and from random people, of what they think that they're going to hear and see from Death of WCW?
From the Who Killed WCW show?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, I think, it's a similar sort of sentiment that you probably would have seen prior to any number of retrospectives about the WCW story. I'm sure that whenever the Nitro book was first announced or people first heard about it, there may have been a feeling of, what else could there possibly be to say, or how could it be covered in any way that was different than before? But I think one of the issues with the way that WWE covered, quote unquote, that particular story in the past is they just left so much on the table. And that's one of the problems, I think, with approaching something with a preconceived notion, or with the idea in mind from the beginning, before you sit down to interview anyone or develop what your story is going to be or conduct any research, to start it with a particular premise, which obviously was the case with the WWE retrospectives. You kind of leave yourself open for other people to come along and do it better. And so, yes, WWE, by virtue of the fact that they bought the company and had all of the footage, they were able to get there first. But because their efforts were inherently self-limiting and had to propagate a certain point of view, that being that, I would say the overwhelming message of really all of their programming about WCW was ultimately only we can do this thing that up until recently we weren't going to even say was pro wrestling, right? Only we can be in the sports entertainment business. Only the McMahons have the brilliance and the creative genius to pull this off. And let's all look back at all of the, let's all sit back and laugh at the pathetic attempt of WCW to compete with us. And certainly WCW left itself open for, they provided a lot of fodder for that kind of look back on what they did. Certainly when you look at some of the stuff that went on prior to the Nitro era, and definitely the insanity of, some of the time during the end of the company as well. So, I think because, yes, this story has been covered and has been addressed numerous times in the past, every time something else comes out, naturally there's going to be that feeling of, well, are we going back to that well again? But again, you have to think about qualitatively what has been the nature of that coverage in the past. And, anytime that you're approaching something with the end result in mind from the beginning, I would argue that if you're looking at it with a discerning eye, that particular thing is destined to fail. Because all you're doing in that situation is just collecting perspectives and materials that already agree with what your point of view is that you've determined in advance. And I think any person who's kind of being critical or has any sort of level of awareness when they're reading something like that or watching something like that, you can feel that viscerally and you can detect that quite early on. And so So yes, it's a long-winded way of saying we have been down this road before, but let's try to think about the nature of that coverage. It's there certainly left a lot to be desired, I would say.
Totally agree. They left too much meat on the bone. And just go back, Brad Siegel, just for 1 second, just to button that up. Turner Classic Movies just celebrated 30 years, and he was the first ever president, and it was about a month or two ago. So that's why he was
Mm.
interviewed. It was all about Turner Classic Movies and basically their big anniversary special. So nothing too crazy out there, but interestingly enough, that's why I wanted to mention that. But man,
Gotcha.
WWE, it just seems like. They just like their narrative. They won the war, so they get to tell it the way they want. Yeah, we get that, but then then leaves way too much meat on the bone, and then the truth isn't necessarily out there. That's just my take on it. I don't know if you agree or not, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think, and again, it's that old cliche that we've heard a million times about the medium being the message. So if you think about the nature of television, the nature of documentaries, the nature of telling a story in visual form, it doesn't always allow for a lot of nuance, whereas a book, for example, does, right? So you can take the time in with the written word to offer multiple perspectives and to say, yeah, this thing that previously we thought was true is partially true, but here's a reason why it's not wholly true. Or here's a notion that's been out there for a while. And actually, if you look at this piece of evidence that I'm about to present you, it will show you something different. You have the space to go into those nuances, and that's kind of what people want, I think, when they're reading a good book. Is you don't just want to read page after page of the same sort of notion being pushed out there, or the same message. You want to get some different opinions. That's not always possible, though, I think, with something like a documentary, or a movie. And so you can kind of see why practically they may have taken that position as well. Not only was it motivated by them trying to put out their sort of propaganda, for lack of a better word, but also technically speaking, you can see why that would have been challenging to say. I mean, take for example the Rise and Fall of WCW DVD. I think, what was that, about 90 minutes in length? Am I right in saying that?
Yes, yes,
So
yep.
they distilled the entire story of WCW down to 90 minutes. Well, that in and of itself, obviously is not going to lend itself to a lot of nuance. You're not going to be able to, incorporate the perspective from people who may have a different point of view, or let's bring in the perspectives of some people who worked on the television side. Let's bring in some of the corporate people. Let's really give a well-rounded account of what happened. You're not going to be able to do that in 90 minutes. So I think some of those flaws are kind of inherent, to that process. um but yes, ultimately, I think if you're looking at it with any level of honesty, you can see that, looking back now, you can almost see that probably one of the, I don't want to say it was a motivating factor, but one of the uh, a very nice byproduct of buying, these tape libraries, is being able to edit the footage and cut and splice things however you want and tell essentially whatever story you want, and that can be, that can have an interesting effect on a viewer when they're presenting you with moment after moment that's reinforcing what one of those talking heads is saying. And so you kind of have to keep your guard up and ask yourself, is this really what happened? Are they really giving me honestly an unbiased account here, or are they just trying to push something on me? So you or I are not the first people by any stretch of the imagination to observe that has happened, time and time again, over the years with regard to their programming, shall we say.
And to me too, I always kind of laugh at some people when they're looking at like micro versus macro. They'll really
Mm.
say, "Oh, ECW did so much for wrestling," but then they'll mention like hardcore, lesbian angles, drinking, smoking, whatever, like all really really tiny micro stuff. And
Mm.
then on the other hand, because WCW was such big competition, almost put WWF out of business. So they say, they really did still try to kind of minimize them, even though WCW created the the pay-per-view format that we know today. They created the Nitro format, aka the Monday Night Raw SmackDown format that we know today. They created a lot of the characters. Once they saw the NWO, they said, we got to make real life, real characters instead of these cartoon characters. You saw Eric Bischoff as a heel bad guy, like who was running the show. So I always think it's funny, like micro versus macro. WCW was the macro. That was like so many things were spawned from WCW that it's fun. They don't kind of get the credit they should. Even Bischoff obviously should get more credit.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the last 18 months to 2 years of the company. I think it left such a bad impression on the part of the viewer, but also people who worked in the company as well. There's so many stories of whether they be production people or individuals that work backstage that just really had such a negative experience and a hard go of things towards the end that for many years that didn't even want to talk about wrestling or talk about WCW in particular, and just had such a bad feeling about it all. And that really informed a lot of the discussion initially after the company closed down for quite some period of time. It was just such a focus on what they did wrong, which there was a lot there to choose from, certainly. So I think that was definitely a big part of it. It's not like circa 2001 WCW was where it was in maybe 97 or 98, and all of a sudden the rug got pulled out from underneath them. The company was really a shell of itself at that point, I would argue, versus where it was at its peak. And that's one of the details, I think, which sometimes gets left out of the discussion as it relates to the ill-fated invasion storyline in 2001. And of course, it is accurate to say that the WWF really fumbled the ball when it came to that, and it could have been done much better, and it could have been much more of a big deal. And all of that is true, but I think sometimes what gets forgotten is the fact that the WCW of 2001 was not the WCW of its heyday. And so, yes, we can look back now and say it should have been the Super Bowl of wrestling. And maybe it's accurate that, under different circumstances, if they were able to bring in all of those guys with a fresh coat of paint in a different environment, maybe you could have overcome the fact that WCW just suffered this significant decline over the last couple of years. And maybe that could have been papered over. We'll never know, obviously. But I always try to keep that in mind when I think about that time. Yes, it could have been done better, but it's not like if you would have imagined, John, mid 1998, for whatever reason, in an alternate universe, there's the blending of these two companies, or some kind of agreement is made that, and of course we're off into fantasy booking, make believe land now. But if there was some kind of agreement where we're going to have the Super Bowl of wrestling every single year, and we're going to get, Goldberg versus Stone Cold and all of these matchups that we've, been talking about and dreaming about for so long, while all of these performers and these companies are at their peak, that's a very different kettle of fish compared to the circumstances in 2001. So hopefully I didn't go too off there on a tangent of your original question, but I think that all of those things contribute to the reasons why sometimes a lot of the things that WCW did well and really innovated, those things get left undiscussed just because of the negative nature of how things wrapped up, and the fact that you go back and look at some of those shows towards the end, and it's like the entire promotion is kind of in shell shock at everything that's happened. And maybe they could have eventually rebuilt and got to somewhere approaching, their peak at a certain point. It was going to take a very long period of time, but again, for obvious reasons, we'll never know.
Do you think that they should have, meaning WWF, should have brought over some more big names for the invasion? Because if you buy out their contract, right, you could have had them instead of had them sitting at home and then returning and making their debut or re-debut a year or two later. Like, could they have just maybe got a couple of names and just bought out the contracts?
Well, I think, again, this is going to be a subjective opinion that I would have to give you on that, because I think it's been fairly well established that there were a number of considerations at play there. Right, they were not in a position to want to break their salary structure. And if you were to bring in a Goldberg, for example, or someone at that level that was making what they were making back at that time, that certainly would have upset the apple cart when it comes to that. And I think, if you think about the fact that WWF, begrudgingly moved into the guaranteed contract era, kicking and screaming, and certainly was probably looking at some of those salaries and saying, we never imagined we'd be paying as many talents as we are this amount of money on a guaranteed basis. You can sort of see the logic in them saying, there's too much risk here in terms of absorbing all of these contracts, or making a play to buy out these contracts. But I think fundamentally the bigger picture is the fact that I think if you look at what we know about Vince McMahon in particular and the way that company was operating at that time, they were never going to present WCW as equals. So even if there was a scenario in which they could have easily integrated all of these top names, they were never going to be presented as a true threat, which, of course, if you think about wrestling psychology, would have been what was needed to really sell that angle at that particular time. When Hall and Nash came in, they weren't beaten up in week 2 or left laying in week 3, or somehow shown to be lacking in the early stages of that storyline. Even though there were only 2 of them initially, they were presented as a existential threat for the entire company. And there's some good and bad elements that come along with that. I mean, I think Kevin Nash has talked about in various places, sort of the lack of logic when it comes to these 2 guys being able to keep the entire locker room at bay. And so if you really want to get into the minutia, you can kind of critique that. But the point is that in order for people to take it seriously, those invading entities, or this invading entity, had to be presented in a serious way. And that was just never going to happen in the WWF. And as a result, if you remember, they kind of brought everyone together on sort of a piecemeal basis, where it seemed like every few months one of these familiar big stars would come in and make a splash for a period of time, but it never really amounted to anything. And we don't even really have to discuss the NWO run, if we can even call it that, in 2002, which ultimately fizzled out. So it obviously, left a lot to be desired and left a lot on the table. And if you look at it on paper, my son is not yet 8 years old, but I could probably give him a blank sheet of paper and he could come up with something better. But it's all about, you have to think about what were the conditions at that particular point in time, and what choices that they have available. And I think, again, it's easy to see why, from a financial standpoint, they would have made that decision. But again, that's aside from the fact that they were never going to promote WCW in the way that was necessary to really make that storyline work.
Yeah, one of those things that, hey, they're never going to let them one up them, even if it's good for business, even though the story would be great, even though the angle would be great. It seemed like Vince was never willing to let them one up him, even if he owned WCW.
Exactly. And also, another thing to keep in mind, I think, is kind of a sidebar, is the fact that in 2001, you think about the online environment. Of course, it was nothing compared to today, but it had evolved quite considerably from 1996. So it was very much known that, yeah, you can kind of present us with this wrestling storyline that Shane McMahon has brought the company, right? But everyone knew what that meant, that the WWF owns their competition now. And so with that being known as widely as it was, I think people obviously were destined to perceive whatever they did as being artificial. And of course, that, I would say, eventually evolved into them doing things like the roster or the brand split and Raw versus SmackDown, and trying for years and years to manufacture that same feeling of real competition. But of course, nothing is going to replace real competition. So, had there been a situation where one company absorbed another, maybe 5 or 6 years earlier, even at that time, I think you possibly could have sold the idea that this is still an independent company that is operating, outside of the other company, at least to a certain segment of the audience that maybe weren't, entirely privy into all of the inner workings. But even by 2001, light years away from today, but there was, a high percentage of the audience that knew exactly what was going on. So I think that was another challenge at the time as well, to be charitable to them, shall we say.
To me, it's one of those things like, what if, like, the Invasion pay-per-view itself, I think did over 800,000 buys. So people were interested,
Hmm.
super interested. And then it just totally went downhill from there. So they had something, they had the interest of the people. They might have had the WCW fans for a minute, and then they left
Hmm.
and became lapsed fans, basically.
That's right. And I think you can probably argue as well, and there's the old cliche once again about wrestling being a cyclical business, but there is a life cycle inherent to any sort of boom in popularity when it comes to any entertainment property or any aspect of television or sports. So you can't maintain that same level of interest forever. So you could argue that maybe all of this kind of coincided with a certain segment of the audience kind of moving on, at least for a period of time, from wrestling. Also, clearly the WWF did themselves no favors at that time with their booking or creative or what have you. But it was interesting to me that you would often hear for years some of the discussion around TNA, where various company officials and others would talk about the fact that, we know that there are these millions of WCW viewers out there, and we just need to figure out where did they go, and we need to bring them back. And that, I guess, kind of made sense technically in maybe 2002 or 2003, but you would hear this kind of rhetoric in like 2012 or 2013, where it's like those people have, if they haven't circled back to some kind of awareness of what's happening in wrestling, as a lot of wrestling fans do, those people are gone. They're watching the UFC, or they've moved on to something else. But it was interesting to me that you would often hear about these millions of viewers that were still out there just waiting for something like the WCW product of yesteryear. But I think, again, another detail or aspect of this which sometimes gets forgotten is, even by 2001, the peak of that wrestling boom had already passed. So the sheer popularity of wrestling, was already on a downswing at that particular point in time. It wasn't like the sale happened when even the WWF was at its absolute apex when it came to viewership figures or any other metric you want to point to, really. Which is indicative of interest. It was past that point, and so there were some headwinds that they were facing if they were going to make that storyline really resonate the way that it did. But again, that's not to excuse what they actually served up to us, which was far, far, far below what it should have been. But this is what happens, John, when we start going into these areas. We start really going into the weeds. So hopefully you have some
Yeah.
patience with me on that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love going into them, and kind of seeing what we could talk about. But as we hit the wind down here and we head towards the finish, tell us again, just Bischoff's book, Nitro book, Penzer book, just
Mm.
maybe a little plug for each, and where everybody could get those books.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. And the best place for people to go, there's really two places. You can either go on Amazon or just go to guyevansbooks.com. And you'll see that there's different options for each of the books. The Nitro book, originally came out in 2018, which is kind of hard to believe now. But in 2020, we came out with the audio book. 2021, the expanded hardcover edition, which has things like show formats and 4 bonus chapters. Eric Bischoff writes the foreword in that edition. I think there's over 100 footnotes to the original story. So I'd really recommend that. If you haven't had time to actually read the book up until this point, you probably want to get the expanded hardcover version. 2022, Grateful came out. So that is really picking up the story of Eric Bischoff's personal and professional life from the time when he left WWE the first time, around sort of 2006 or so, all the way up until 2022 when the book came out. So he goes into his whole TNA experience and going back to the WWE in 2019 and some of the difficulties he's faced, namely filing for bankruptcy and being on the verge of a really, well, in fact, experiencing a financial disaster for a period of time, and how he got himself out of that. So that's a really interesting read and a very unique book as well, because we're really balancing, yes, some of the big wrestling stories, but I think people will take away a lot from how he describes how he navigated around some of these challenges. And then the recent book, as you mentioned, is with Dave Penzer, Sitting Ringside, and that is the story of his professional life and his journey that he's gone on from being, the super fan after discovering wrestling at 11 years old to being sort of the ultimate fly on the wall during the WCW days. And then the nice thing about that book is you finish the story, full length autobiography, and then you have another couple hundred pages to flick through. And you can see, as we talked about, the last Nitro format and all of these other really historic, documents from that time frame as well. So Amazon, GuyEvansBooks.com. And I think, as the weeks and months move on here, we're going to have a whole lot of other stuff to talk about in this same vein of WCW and Monday Night Wars as well. So just want to say I appreciate the time once again, John, and hope we get a chance to do this again very soon.
Yes, absolutely. Where can everybody find you social media wise?
Yeah, so probably the best place to go is to go on Twitter or X or whatever we're supposed to call it nowadays. You can find me there at Guy Evans Books. We also have an account for the Nitro book itself, which is at WCW Nitro Book. So if you want to get in touch, send me a message or ask a question or what have you, those are the best places to do it.
All right, Guy, thank you so much for all the time today. Really appreciate it.
You are very welcome, John. Thank you.